Chapter 23. The Touched. The Fourth Hell. Malinka walked forward, the glassy ground beneath her crunching and shattering with every step. She held her axes in her hands tightly as she surveyed the hundreds of snarling, mindless touch that were shoving past and crawling over each other. Her stride matched Anders. She held her head high and her knuckles were white with anticipation of the seemingly unavoidable battle before her. Thoughts raced through her mind in the short walk from Crinan's side to the would-be battlements. She thought of the touched, how they had once been people with their own hopes and dreams. Somebody somewhere had once loved the creatures she was about to kill, had mourned the loss when they died. Malinka grew angry at this thought. Before her was the culmination of the efforts of Govia. These touched were what the Empire ultimately created, the final rung of oppression, a shell of a person, chaos and pain manifested in a shambling, tormented body. Ander walked alongside Malinka, his hands glowing with the magic that he had been so eager to use in Sincroft. Malinka looked over at him and didn't see the uneasiness she felt within herself. She saw an unmistakable appearance of confidence plastered on the Vampre's face, a look in his eyes that suggested he wanted whatever was about to happen to them. "'Tis but another hill upon the path to greatness," Ander proclaimed as the two walked, "one which we will scale together. Dare I say, my friend?" Malinka nodded and flared her nostrils tenaciously. The touched were closing the distance between them. She could smell and hear them as they drew nearer. Ander stopped walking, and so did she. He watched them for a moment before raising his flaming hands, and she watched as the fire suddenly grew in intensity. "Do try to keep them off me," Ander said as he spread his arms out wide. "If any of them manage to get this far, that is." Malinka nodded and then jumped back as Ander's arms began exploding with magic. Shells of fire blasted off him like mortar fire, arcing through the air and leaving trails of smoke behind. The projectiles crashed through the ranks of the touched, bursting upon impact with the ground. Malinka stared in awe of the display, watching bodies burst apart in bright flashes of light. The horde of touch screamed as one and broke into an awkward sprint as they charged forward. What could have previously been considered a mob transformed into a howling, awkward cluster of bodies that scratched and clawed forward toward their target. Malinka observed with morbid curiosity as they thrashed at one another, ripping into each other's flesh as they moved closer. For a moment, her stance faltered, and she took a clumsy step backward. How could she fight something like that? How could she survive? The artillery barrage from Ander ended, and Malinka glanced over at him curiously. A smug yet vacant expression was painted across his face. He looked as if all the power came naturally to him, as if this situation was comfortable. It was almost as if he were home. In that single glance, the ever-intuitive nature of Malinka led her to shiver. In spite of the strange comfort she saw in Ander's face, Malinka stared at his eyes. They worked in contrast with his jubilance, darting around wildly and showing a fear that stuck out like a sore thumb. Malinka watched the eyes turn her way, locking onto her, and for a moment she thought she sensed pleading in those eyes, a sort of begging for help. Ander blinked away the expression and then looked away from her. His hands flashed with power, and he sent a new rapid-fire barrage of tiny fireballs into the horde of touched. Malinka watched as the more concentrated blasts blew their targets apart, sending gore and giblets in all directions. Where had this power come from? How was Ander so adept with his abilities in the Hells? Not long ago, he had been a mere prisoner, someone who couldn't use abilities at all. She concluded that he must have had a mastery of his abilities back when he was alive in the ancient times. Perhaps he was some kind of soldier in their armies so long ago. "Ready yourself," Ander called out to her. "The touched are approaching. Prepare for engagement."
"Affirmative,"
Malinka replied, steeling herself. She watched a handful of touch that had broken off the group awkwardly run toward her with hands outstretched. A couple held rusty weapons, and one even had armor, but they all looked vacant and stupid. Ander individually disposed of a few of them, but one with a sword hissed as he darted toward Malinka. Malinka stepped out of the way of the sloppy sword strike, and with a mighty bellow escaping her lips, she drove the head of her axe through the bridge of the creature's nose and into his brain. His body spasmed for a moment, and he dropped his sword as he reflexively reached up to remove the obstruction. Black-curdled goo seeped around her axe, and as his death caught up with him, he went limp and fell off Malinka's weapon into a pile on the ground. A hoarse scream came from her right, and Malinka ducked in time to avoid a fist barreling toward her. She shot forward, thrusting her shoulder into the creature's diaphragm and knocking it off its feet. It flailed its arms as it tumbled backward. As it landed on its back against the ground, Malinka swung her axe downward and clove through its skull, splitting it apart and spilling more oily black goo all over the ground. "Vigilance, Malinka!" Ander cried out to her. "More touched inbound!" With a snarl, Malinka looked up and saw 3 touched running toward her. She quickly took off into a sprint, resolving to kill the 2 with weapons first. The nearest one took an axe strike to its sword arm and then a subsequent one to its chest. The appendage was cut free with ease, and it stumbled backward from the second attack, its dusty body now slick and oily with the rotten ichor that filled it. Another swiped at her with a club, striking her in the ribs. She spat a line of curses as she reeled in pain, and then used her momentum to spin and hack clean through the creature's neck. Oily blackness spewed onto her face, and she gasped in revulsion as the final touch leaped at her. Malinka was just able to step out of the way of the tackle and pivoted as she swung both her axes, slamming them into the touched's back. The creature crashed into the ground, and she pulled an axe free. Without another thought, she crashed the weapon through the creature's temple, removing half its head.
"By the brothers,"
Malinka panted as she scrambled to her feet. She wiped the sweat and ichor off her brow with the back of her hand and turned to look back at Dolly and Krynen. Dolly had her fingers inserted in Krynen's chest, and Krynen was arching his back, clearly in pain. Though Malinka could not hear him scream over the commotion going on around her, she briefly smiled at the sight of his discomfort, but then frowned, reflecting on all he had done to find himself in the position he was in. Krynen Jameson was a name that had almost become myth to Malinka. She didn't want her thoughts to cloud her judgment in the scuffle she was currently in, but as she rose to her feet and turned toward the next wave of touched dashing toward her, she couldn't help but hear her heart speaking louder than her mind should have allowed. The head of an axe smashed through the side of another touched's head as she reflected on the situation she was in. Krynen was her first true love, and the thought of him had kept her awake and playing scenarios in her head many a night back in the real world. She wouldn't say she obsessed over the idea of him, over what could have been, but she would admit that it was something that weighed heavily on her heart. She wanted him. She wanted to be with the boy she fell in love with back in the forests of Camelot. The idea that he had fully ghosted her cut her deeply, and it was a wound that she constantly picked the scab off of, preventing it from ever truly healing. Malinka split another skull and roared with frustration and adrenaline-fueled fury as the creature fell and another ran up in its place. She hated Krynen for what he hadn't done, yet she loved him deeply. Her thoughts raced back to when she first saw him approaching her in the Hells. She had given up, accepted her fate of being nothing more than a toy for the players. But, as if it were one of her dreams, Krynen killed those who would harm her. He saved her, and while she was disgusted with the idea that she would have ever been in a position where she needed saving in the first place, a part of her heart had been both warmed and excited by the fact that her savior was the person she fell in love with so long ago. But she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of knowing that he, even after all these years of silence and avoidance, still made her heart pound like a marauder war drum. She wanted him to feel as unwanted and reviled as she felt for so many years. It only seemed fair in her mind. She wouldn't give him an inch. She wouldn't allow him to feel any semblance of closeness to her. Malinka batted a sword out of the way and screamed as she drove her axes into the ribs of the next touched. Her eyes grew wide and she gnashed her teeth in fury as she ripped her weapons free and then planted them into the creature's neck. She couldn't control her frustration, for she knew the walls around her heart were breaking down in Krynan's presence. She didn't want to keep him at arm's length. She wanted to feel his arm's length around her. She wanted him to grunt something stupid as he held her, to whisper awkward words of comfort that he didn't truly know how to formulate into her ears.
Brothers, damn it all!
Malinka seethed as the last touched fell. She hated how she was feeling. She hated that she was opening up to him again. She knew he would never intentionally harm her, but she also knew that he had hurt her more than any person in her entire life. Even more than the Imperial Princess Dansire Sidro, who had cut her down in the battlefield and sent her to the Hells. Malinka stood and panted, her whole body throbbing in time with her pounding heart. She clenched her teeth and gripped her axes with sweaty, ichor-soaked hands. Ander was moving forward, blasting at the remnants of the touched horde, and Malinka looked back again to see Krynan sitting up, his face buried in his hands. Seeing him fully healed sent a wave of comfort through her anxious body, and she cursed at the feeling. Ander's barrage finally stopped, and he watched for a moment, before lowering his hands and then falling to his knees. Malinka's eyes grew wide with concern, and she ran over to him, catching him before he fell to the ground. "I do believe I have overextended myself," Ander said with a wheeze. That takes a lot out of you."
Whatever you did, it was amazing,
Malinka replied, gently helping him to a sitting position on the ground.
Your abilities are unlike anything I've seen in the real world before.
Ander looked down at his hands in awe. "I know nothing of the power that I wield, only that it comes when I wish to kill."
You did great,
Malinka said, gently cupping Ander's cheek.
I'm proud of you, my friend.
Ander looked up at Malinka with a worn expression on his face, but beneath his mustache a weak but sincere smile formed. He looked genuinely happy to have received praise, as if it was the first time in his life that he had felt appreciated. Ander's head lowered and his shoulders rose and fell with his breathing. I need a moment to rest," Ander said. "You go see how Krynan is doing. We all need to get moving very soon."